Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Effective Altruism Lausanne talk. This talk is part of a series we're organizing with EAL Lausanne. If you find yourself interested in what we do, go grab a snack after with us and have a chat. You can also reach out through effectivealtruism.ch/Lausanne. This time we're welcoming Konrad. He's going to talk about the Simon Institute for Long-Term Governance. So Konrad is a co-founder of EA Geneva and is now working for this organization that is going to present. If you have questions, please ask them through Slido with the number on the screen. It's also written here, so that it's easier to set up the Q&A afterwards. You can also vote for the questions you like. So yeah, thank you, Konrad. I give you the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, so I want to talk a bit about what I've been working on for at least full-time the last year, and at least part-time for the last probably 4 years. So there's a lot to cover, and I'm happy to also cover a lot of different kinds of questions at the end. Feel free to shoot anything at me, and if anything is unclear, you can also in between interrupt. Yeah, the idea is that at the moment, future generations aren't entirely taken into account. So a question is, how can we take them into account in policy systems? And in our case, the multilateral system, which I will say a few things on later in the talk. I will go through how I ended up here, why it might be worth engaging more with the UN or the multilateral system more broadly, and what SI is up to. But first, let's take a step back. This dot represents everyone who's alive right now, roughly 8 billion people. These dots represent everyone who has lived until now, so also dead people. And this is how we've thought about the future for quite a few years, not too long ago, and that doesn't seem entirely accurate. If humans survive for as long as the average mammalian species, this is how many people will live. So that's 200,000 more years. But humans don't really seem to be the average mammalian species. So maybe for those of you that like big numbers, we can think a bit further. We could think about settling the Milky Way or the entirely physically reachable universe, which seems a bit speculative, but it does put things into perspective. And then maybe the future looks a bit different, but this is probably still nothing close to what it will actually look like, because it just surpasses our imagination of what could be. Yeah, I think that's mostly due to human limits. But what we know now already is that things have been getting better. So the future is also quite exciting, because these trends might all very well continue, and they've also only really picked up in recent decades. So a lot of like the extreme betterment of humanity is fairly new. Of course, all these changes also have caused effects that are more worrying, like climate change. Also, we invented first weapons that can destroy ourselves, and we're on the track to potentially doing so again with synthetic biology and higher AI capacities. And these problems might hit us even sooner and faster / more unexpectedly than climate change. Climate change, we now have a good understanding of. We have ever better models, but emerging technology is still fairly undervalued in terms of risk potential. On the other side, it has extreme upside potential as well. So the question really is, how do we govern this? How do we think about governing things in the long term? And for that, we usually end up thinking about policymaking or about markets or about like self-governance. But I want to focus on policymaking in particular. So policymaking is this weird black box where you want to have some kind of effect on the world has probably some kind of effect on your policymaking, ideally, not always. But so you write a bunch of texts and then you expect that to make some kind of difference. That's what a lot of people think of when they think of policymaking. In the background, though, there's a lot going on, from theater to research to people just brainstorming and people connecting with one another. The theater is usually what people think of when they hear politics and not all the other stuff that happens in the background. And so then we have all these bodies that are supposed to govern, and then they are also supposed to take into account timeframes that aren't really conceivable to them. So that's the problem of like, how do we feed this back into our policymaking? And to approach this, my friends and I at EA Geneva almost 5 years back thought, hey, okay, we will just start a working group called Understanding and Improving Policymaking and solve the problem. And this abstract thinking was interesting, yielded a recent publication, will hopefully yield one or two more. But we also realized that in that process, there just isn't that much you can actually figure out in terms of concrete engagement, because you miss feedback loops with reality. Like at the moment, you can't really collect a lot of data on how people behave in policymaking settings because they don't want you to collect data on their behavior for obvious reasons. Like then they would just receive more scrutiny, or it turns out that they actually don't reason that well. And thus, you can create all kinds of models of decision-making dynamics or of decision processes, but it's very unlikely that you can get anywhere without previous buy-in. So we thought, okay, like, where do we want to get buy-in? Where can we get buy-in? In the process of conducting this research, we also just interviewed lots of people, lots of policymakers, lots of academics. So we had a pretty good network and thought, okay, our network actually starts with the UN, and the UN has some claim to having impact on certain dimensions. The UN is gigantic, or it seems gigantic, at least in the beginning. So there are lots of different bodies, lots of different organizations, such that usually we refer to the UN system and not the UN. Like there's no homogeneous agent that is the UN. There's no central decision-making power. And often we end up thinking about the General Assembly and the Security Council. But there are also lots of other agencies, specialized agencies, that do many different things. So to tease apart a bit what the UN is, we can first look at staff numbers and maybe compare them to other countries. So the UN spends around 60 billion at this point in time per year and has 116,000 employees. Switzerland spends around 80 billion a year and has 40,000 employees. So the money each employee has actually power over, on average, is much higher in Switzerland, which suggests that maybe the UN is a bit underfunded, or like employees in the UN might have less power. Then if you compare this to the US spends almost $7 trillion, and the federal government has almost 3 million employees. So in scale, given the problems that these different organizations face, there is definitely some mismatch.
Is spending on the salaries, or the spending are like
spending in general, all like government programs, or so like also UN data is less reliable than Swiss government data and US government data, simply because the UN system is also not a perfectly aligned system, and also like budget numbers have only been unified across all the agencies very recently, so reporting is also less suboptimal. But yeah, so this gives us a first idea of the fact that maybe the UN is not entirely overpowered or not like supported well enough to actually do its job. And then there's an interesting other difference, that the UN has mainly two big hubs. Of course, there's also Vienna, and then lots of organizations in slightly other places, but mainly there's New York and Geneva. And New York is mainly the secretariat and a handful of organizations around it. So it's really powering a lot of the intergovernmental processes. And Geneva actually has more specialized agencies. It's the humanitarian hub, human rights, it's the global health hub, it's the center of also most disarmament activities, etc. So also most conferences with multi-stakeholder approaches actually happen in Geneva and not in New York, which already gives us some context, because out of the roughly 40 to 44,000 employees at the core of the UN, 33,000 work for the Secretariat. So like for activities that basically support Secretary General activities, General Assembly and Security Council activities. And then in Geneva, a lot of the ecosystem is supported by lots of foundations, NGOs, research centers that aren't even counted into the UN system. So here, the multi-stakeholder approach is very different. And you have also other network effects because Geneva is so small. So in Geneva, everyone quickly knows one another, whereas New York is really big. New York is international in general, but Geneva is international because of the UN. So there's also a different identity between people, more of a shared sense of we are all working together. Of course, there are also people who are just there for like career opportunities, etc. But there's definitely more of a shared sense of we're trying to achieve something. So we thought, okay, actually Geneva is quite a good place to learn more about who is really trying to do something and who's just there to like chill out and benefit from the fact that they don't pay taxes. So we engaged a lot with various UN activities, and in the first year of SI, looked mainly at biosecurity because it was the pandemic and we had already wanted to work on pandemic preparedness before that, because it just seemed like there were many straightforward things you could propose and figure out how to change. And then we also sat down with researchers, got them to think about, okay, how can we make our research more relevant? And in the end, figured out, okay, you really need to just bring the different worlds together, like Greta and Prince Charles, I suppose, I'm actually not sure, at the World Economic Forum. And then maybe you can get researchers to do more policy relevant research, because if you look at certain research topics that seem more interesting than pandemic preparedness or human extinction, like baldness or conspiracy theories, then maybe there's also just a mismatch in terms of what's really needed and what gets you publications or what pushes the knowledge frontier. So to get this discussion going, during the pandemic, we got together lots of policy brokers, so people who are kind of at the interface in various governmental organizations of science and policy, so people who have some policymaking power, and we put them together with researchers to really figure out, okay, if we think about existential risks that threaten future generations, how do we actually approach this? How can we practically make steps forward? And that also brings us to, how does policy change even happen? Often, if you look at the literature, the circle that's in the background, this like neat little awareness raising, problem definition, identification of options, etc. That's what you will see as an abstraction of the policy process. And that's quite informative because you know, okay, there are certain steps that happen in some form, but reality is that usually it's a hectic back and forth. And at some point there's a decision, and there wasn't really a clear process of this is how we do step by step. And then this is the group that makes a decision. It's usually more driven by external events. And that we also see in terms of budget changes of all government organizations, whether it's democracies, autocracies, whether it's international organizations, whether it's nation states, etc. You see that very few events cause most of the changes in budget allocation. So really, it's like wars are exceptionally bad. This is for the US. And then you see this across the world, in China, in Germany, in the UN, in the EU, etc. Same pattern. Very few changes account for, very few events account for most of the changes. So that's really just the key thing in policy change. That means there are very few opportunities to also disproportionately impact budget allocation and policy focused. So then if we want to figure out policy change, we can also look at trends of how attention shifts. So we can look at importance of a policy problem and the extent of policy change in relation to a policy problem. So if assuming a policy problem linearly becomes more important over time, then attention doesn't follow linearly because we can't follow information as closely and like update incrementally as the importance changes in the real world. So what happens to aligned networks usually is that you have more of these phase shifts. So you have sudden jumps, and they so like usually the network underreacts and then overreacts. So like it just like overcorrects. And then the question is, okay, like when can we afford to underreact and when can we not? So looking at risks just seems very clear we need more preparedness. We really need to look at where are periods of underreactions that might harm us substantially. And in terms of windows of opportunity, there actually is a bunch at the moment that is happening in policy circles. So whether it's the EU or national governments or the UN, there are more and more reports on our political nature, how we reason, how these networks work, but also on existential risks, on things that threaten our future or just unlock a lot of future potential. And one key thing for us at the Simon Institute is the recent report called Our Common Agenda from the UN Secretary General. That is kind of the agenda for his next term of 5 years, but it will also very likely feed into the Sustainable Development Goals, which are part of the UN's 2030 agenda. And that means in 2030, these goals need to be reevaluated, and this Our Common Agenda will feed into these goals again. So as you can see, the goals currently don't really contain any representation for future generation. They don't contain much on emerging tech, neither on the upsides nor on the downsides. And generally, the sustainability narrative is very focused on things that just assume that we will naturally continue to exist and not live through major shocks. But Our Common Agenda actually ended up introducing, so the report ended up introducing the concept of existential risks, and then also got adopted by the General Assembly. So it was turned into an intergovernmental process, which in the UN either means member states want to kill it or they actually want to do something. Given the current climate, it really risks to be boycotted, but we might be able to turn this around because there's also not yet that much engagement, that much framing that has happened. And you can also affect what's happening in the General Assembly. But so why is this relevant? We now have this concept of existential risks in a report that created an intergovernmental process. That's simply because this narrative is actually relevant for people to get the big picture context of their policymaking. And I think that is one of the key lessons we learned also in the context of our interviews, that most people, once they have to buckle up and like do the work, they forget the big picture context. But that also means that you will make decisions that are not necessarily very amenable for future generations. So this narrative that Our Common Agenda proposes contains an idea of breakdown or breakthrough, that maybe the next few decades are extremely crucial for the development of our civilization. It also talks about intertemporal and international solidarity, so that we need to think about how our social contract relates to future generations, what we burden them with, etc. And it talks about complementing the SDGs with more preparedness, with a consideration of existential risks and of intergenerational global public goods, which are things like existential risk reduction, because these are global and intergenerational. And thus, the question is, how did something like this happen? That this was actually included in such a substantial report that in the ideal case, in the next 5 years gets picked up by more and more organizations and more nation states. So it essentially happened because of this guy. I removed his last name because I don't want him to get more emails. He's already quite occupied. But David was in touch with various people in different organizations that are already working on existential risks for many years. So he was personally in contact with researchers working on advanced AI, on biosecurity, on nuclear security, etc. And then one of these researchers published a book, The Precipice, outlining all these risks and saying, okay, we're in potentially a very threatening point in human civilization and in human development. And then COVID happened at the same time. So there were a bunch of focusing events that made it very easy for David then in the office of the Secretary General to say, hey, maybe we should pay attention to this. And since we are currently writing this report, we should probably include that. And he could just hand out books to his colleagues that then also read that and had a better understanding for it. So in policy, a lot hinges on like single individuals often that manage to instrumentalize opportunities. And usually these individuals are called policy entrepreneurs in the literature. So in our common agenda, there are 12 commitments. And I think there are at least 5 that are definitely very relevant to anyone interested in EA and more the long-termist perspective. And I think that is very clearly promoting peace and preventing conflicts, then also thinking about AI governance, upgrading the United Nations, listen to the youth more, which also includes then figuring out how to represent future generations because they can't be listened to if they don't have a voice, and foster general preparedness. Just for an overview, what hides behind these, the idea of a new agenda for peace is to really figure out how to get countries to commit to ways to make conflict more legible, or like potential conflict more legible, such that it can also be avoided faster. And it includes a bunch of stuff on space. So space governance is likely to become much more important in the next few years if we continue to have more and more companies and then potentially also nation states to continue ramping up their explorations. And that also seems like a great precedence for general like coordination between nation states and might actually make it easier or harder, of course, if it gets polarized. Then the Global Digital Compact seems relevant because they explicitly talk about artificial intelligence and they talk about the digital commons as a global public good, which also then could allow for discussion of, for example, digital people, which currently isn't really on anyone's radar or isn't taken particularly serious. But if it is possible, we should probably at least have thought about it and have some framework for reference for it. And then the UN 2.0 is simply a good idea because they also want to be more efficient, and then helping them do that seems relatively useful. So there's the newly set up high-level advisory board on global public goods, which is supposed to send a report to the General Assembly to inform them of how they can do better. At the moment, they are lacking ideas, kind of beyond climate change governance, and that's part of what SI is actively working on. And then there's the idea to reestablish the scientific advisory board of the Secretary General. There, it's like probably useful to have more science input, but one also has to see the position of the Secretary General, which is one of serving the General Assembly and the Security Council. So usually the Secretary Generals stay extremely neutral and only like push for certain things that seem mostly commonly agreed on. But they also just want to generally become more data-driven. The UN at the moment is quite a mess, many different organizations, not perfect coordination at all. And you could probably do quite a lot if you would just aggregate data better and have better information exchange. So there's a lot of infrastructure building that's necessary. Then on future generations, they actually want to establish a youth office. They will have a transforming education summit that is supposed to prepare curricula that are just generally better fit for the fast pace at which our societies are evolving. And then there will be a summit of the future next year in September, where there will be some announcements of plans for better representation of future generation, but also of various other ideas and processes that will lead up to better space governance, the Global Digital Compact, the Agenda for Peace, etc. And they want to establish a futures lab that also publishes a global risk report, for which they will need input from experts on these topics. So that's also something where SI is actively working together with the UN Secretary General's office and the UN University to really make sure that there's quite a diverse set of input and a representative set from across the world that goes into this report and into potentially also developing the Futures Lab itself. And then there are a bunch of other ideas for future generations representation, like an envoy for future generations. For preparedness, we are actually talking about a WHO treaty on pandemic preparedness at this point in time internationally, which could be quite relevant. Also, general plans to strengthen the WHO are discussed again. And having emergency platforms to respond to complex global crises are also in discussion. At the moment, there's either a weapon attack for which the Biological Weapons Convention is relevant, or a natural pandemic for which the WHO is responsible, more or less. And in between, like everything that is uncertain, there's no clear body that is responsible for taking care of the issue. So there's a joint assessment mechanism now between WHO and the BWC that's being discussed. It's not set up yet. Yeah, so there are a bunch of ideas that seem very relevant. And there is a timeline for how things will happen. So this year, there's this Transforming Education Summit. Then next year, there's the Summit of the Future, where the High-Level Advisory Board plays a big role in setting this up. And there are 7 tracks that are along the lines of the topics I've just listed. And these tracks, currently, it's unclear how they will develop, how things will be set up, simply because it is now an intergovernmental process and the General Assembly needs to discuss everything and then make up its mind. This also means that at the moment, there aren't that many stakeholders involved in shaping this process. And if you get involved in shaping this process, you probably have a decent amount of capacity to give advice and just be generally useful to the General Assembly, to the Secretary General's office, and other parties who are organizing this. Then in 2025, there will be a World Social Summit where people actually want to talk about this social contract at a global and intergenerational level. So again, there will probably be lots of opportunities for engagement and for framing the international narrative. And now the question, of course, is, okay, like, how do you do any of this? But here again, it's mainly about policy champions and entrepreneurs. If you can figure out ways to engage and for more senior people to champion your ideas, you're very likely to push things forward. And then if there is alignment of attention and opinions on specific topics, you can actually push for policy change. And that doesn't have to happen at the international level. So you can also do this at regional levels or at like very small cantonal levels, but you can produce policy precedents and then have an establishment of best practices, of like guidelines, of just first trials that then generate data on how useful it is, etc., and then expect transfer and diffusion. And the UN is quite useful in this. If we look at, for example, the different standardization bodies or the WHO, as in such that often it sets the narrative, it sets an agenda, and that allows countries to slot into this narrative and figure out, okay, what are we actually doing about this? And then depending on how well resourced the organizations are, that allows them sometimes to also have regional offices, support countries in their implementation, etc. So that's why this like broad narrative can be quite relevant. So I think in terms of what to aim for practically, we could aim for a redefinition of sustainability. Everyone has started to talk about sustainability. That is kind of part of the success of these sustainable development goals, which were established from 2013 to 2015. The agenda was announced in 2015. And if we now in 2030 get an update that includes existential risk as kind of the ultimate sustainability issue, because if there's nothing to sustain, the concept of sustainability seems kind of unnecessary, and maybe also gives people an impetus to think beyond planetary bounds, because that seems like it's necessary given the acceleration of developments in terms of space exploration. And then at the moment, there's also not much talk about emerging technologies. There's some talk about innovation, but nothing about the disruptive up and downside potential of emerging tech. So generally, there needs to be more of a focus in sustainability also on these issues. We have a focus on climate change, which is great, and I think has already had quite a big effect. So like the new IPCC report says, okay, we're likely to stay under 3 degrees. We still need to do more, but we're like not at this absolute hellscape scenario. And so these kind of updates are quite useful. Of course, assessing the impact of the SDGs on our like climate action is not obvious, but it's likely to have caused significant convergence together with the IPCC's work on what is important and what do we need to get done. And it's really been adopted across the private sector, across government, across the nonprofit sector, etc. Thus, it might also be useful to reshape the narrative here. And that could also be done by, for example, conceiving of future generations beyond 2100, because that's currently the reference frame the UN employs. It's understandable because 70 years is already quite far for most people to think ahead, or 80. But it also means that a lot of the thinking around future generations is kind of misled at the moment, insofar that you think of who is going to be born in the next 80 years, but it's possible that nobody gets born in a few decades, or that billions of people will be born after that. And it seems kind of weird to just randomly have this cutoff point and neglect all this future potential. So we need to at least theoretically take that into account. And then I think one of the key challenges for groups like EA and the long-termist field is really to get a representative set of people who advocate for these kind of things. Because at the moment, it's very understandable that people from various southern countries say, hey, what the hell, like, yeah, you can talk about technology, but we have other problems. And we're going to be hit hardest by climate change. We're going to have the biggest increase in population size, etc. And they are so under-resourced often that they also aren't necessarily aware of the, like, for example, emerging technologies that are coming up on the horizon. So we need to foster more contact and exchange with southern countries just to be able to actually have a dialogue and really build a representative alliance on these issues. And maybe also to update our views in terms of what is priority, and just understand that, yeah, we cannot do this alone, simply because at the international level, there will be a lot of things that just get blocked or like bogged down in politics if we end up just being a group of white people who have like certain ideas about the future that has happened before and it's gone quite wrong. So like there are reasonable priors that that's not as straightforward. And so we also should be a bit humble with respect to how we go about this, how we design policy recommendations, etc., how we do research. So I think what is needed is more independent diplomacy. That's simply because a lot of international affairs is quite underpowered, and you can reach out to representatives from countries. You can reach out to various bodies from different countries if you want to talk to them and just like figure out what do they actually think, what are they trying to achieve, what do they understand about the future, what do they understand about emerging tech, etc., and already help to foster mutual understanding, which is a thing that at the moment isn't obvious. And that also means you can engage more in policy networks. Of course, that always costs time and resources and is often quite opaque, but there are also more and more actors that are popping up that are supposed to support this. For example, in Geneva, there's now the Geneva Science Policy Interface. EPFL has this International Risk Governance Council, or International Risk Governance Center, I think it was recently renamed. And they are all in touch with governance bodies. They try to write reports and consult and give advice. So there are ways to plug into policy networks that might be quite relevant also for you scientists. And then again, we need representatives from developing countries. And we need a lot more practical research. I've already alluded to it, but a lot of research pushes the knowledge frontier. And often we have enough research, like we know what we need to do or what would be useful to implement, etc. We don't need to push the knowledge frontier to improve policy. Usually we need to figure out how to align people on what we need and on what priorities are. And that means we need people who can translate between these worlds and come up with concrete proposals for how to do stuff. And one idea here that would be quite useful is differential technology development, which might be relevant for most of you, which is just this idea that different technologies have different risk profiles. And if we develop technologies first that decrease the risk profiles of other technologies, then we're probably better off because it's less likely that we get screwed over by ourselves, by our progress. And thus identifying kind of the development trees of various technologies and figuring out which branches we want to go down first to then go down other branches that previously seemed riskier, but then might be less risky, etc., would be quite useful. At the moment, there's approximately no research on this. I know one researcher that works on this full-time and a few that think about it vaguely. So that just seems like a very useful thing to figure out in terms of tech progress. And then, as I said before, we need more policy precedents, we need best practices, we need guidelines, we need just practical ways to start thinking about the problems and also the promises, such that we can start converging on how to even discuss these topics and how to move forward. And I think that is the first general overview I want to give you of what can be done in policy and some concrete ideas of why that might be useful. And I want to use the rest of the time to have discussion and answer questions and can happily talk about more whatever you find interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you have questions, don't hesitate to put them on the Slido and upvote the ones that you like. So the first question is, do you believe the United Nations are a good way of creating change at the world scale, or is it the only available way?
So, as I said before, I think the UN can mean like many things. And I think the way I think about it at the moment is that it is the only thing at international level that exists. And I don't think we need to aim for changing the UN fundamentally, but it does provide lots of fora, thematic discussion opportunities, where lots of people from relevant organizations, governments, etc., come together to discuss under a fairly cosmopolitan framing. And so you can actually meet a lot of people in a context that is much more amenable to EA goals than like national security setting or so, where you're like, oh, if I increase a country's thinking in terms of security, then that's likely to decrease their cooperation at an international level, for example. Of course, that might be worth it sometimes if you're like particularly worried about certain things happening. But I think in general, we can usually think that international cooperation makes things more robust, at least long-term. Short-term strategies might disagree with that. And then the UN just provides a platform for fora to engage people. So then you can either figure out, okay, are there little pockets of organizations' activities or something like this within the UN that we can work with that are more agentic than the large behemoth? Or can we just like use the fact that we've now made these connections and do other things outside? And I think then in terms of the narrative that the UN provides, it is still quite powerful to have 193 countries that sign off on a certain report and say, hey, okay, like we think these are global priorities. And that also allows people at the national level to then say, hey, okay, there's this agenda, and actually we're currently not paying attention to like this part of this agenda, such that it makes advocacy or like policy change easier. Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting. The next one, how concretely can you try to include more the global south into these changes that you want to make?
Yeah, good question. I wish I had a really good answer to this, because I think it's part of the most valuable thing that could be done. I think often the problem is that we don't really know where to start. Like we have a handful of developing countries that are in a fairly good position at this point in time. Like in Latin America, usually Mexico is like one of the countries that's more motivated to also pick up the lead at an international level. Costa Rica is. Then in African countries, you have Kenya and often a handful of other actors, but they at the diplomatic level are often so under-resourced that one ambassador is responsible for everything. So like they have one person in Geneva, and then you can't really talk to them. So you need to figure out, okay, what are the relevant think tanks that we can reach out to? And often they also don't have a think tank ecosystem locally. So you might go to Nigerian academics or just people in the government that you know, but usually that's probably via personal networks. And that's the thing that we need to build up. So there's just a need for creating these kind of networks and then fora for discussion, whether this is some kind of conference or some summer fellowship or ways to actually get people together into the same room and think about it. And then in Southeast Asia, you have Singapore that's like quite keen on doing these things. They also do quite a lot of foresight work. But you would also want to probably get people from the Philippines and other places. And there you have the advantage that there are at least some EA groups, for example. So maybe they are amenable to like figuring out, okay, what can we do locally? Yeah. It's hard.
What is needed for the Simon Institute to take the challenge to the next level?
At this point, funding. We are in discussion with funders, but we also don't know how fast we can grow. Max and I don't have experience in like growing an organization, so we also want to take that very slow because we want to build a solid infrastructure. And I think then the second best thing would be more people who also engage with these processes and then still coordinate really well. So if there are other organizations that pop up that want to complement engagement with these ideas or with this our common agenda, etc., from national perspectives, that's probably useful. More funding for us. I think at some point we would probably try to re-grant to other individuals we think might be doing good work. But yeah, again, this would require like quite a lot of capacity and quite a lot of thinking that we haven't done yet. And beyond this, yeah, what I said before in terms of what is needed, I think just figuring out who you know, who you could make introductions to, who might be a policy champion at a more senior level, who might know other relevant people for alliance building, etc. That could be super useful. So just like give us more resources also at a network level. Yeah.
Do you know of other organizations that are doing the same line of work that you are doing?
Not exactly, but we're working with a few organizations that are or used to be mainly research focused, and now are like looking into exploring the policy side of things more. And that's like, for example, the Center for the Study of Existential Risks, some people at the Future of Humanity Institute, some people at the Future of Life Institute, and then there's the UN University, which is a sub part of the UN essentially. Then there is the UN Foundation that also is interested in at least our common agenda broadly. And yeah, beyond that, there are a handful of think tanks that are thinking about also SDG development. So there's one group in London that we recently encountered, but we are not yet in touch with them, called Futerra, and they have suggested changes to the Sustainable Development Goals that seem quite sensible. And then there's one Brazilian think tank that is surprisingly big that we also haven't been in touch with because they are in, I think, Rio and New York. So no direct connection, but they at least published a bunch of things on our common agenda and like taking things forward. But yeah, they are called Igarape, I think. So yeah, in case you want to look that up.
Any questions from the audience?
Why do you think that the UN 2.0 is relevant for effective altruism?
Yeah, is the UN 2.0 relevant for effective altruism? I think that is very unclear. I think you might conclude that the UN in its current shape is like profoundly paralyzed, and there are only certain parts that are useful. So approaching UN 2.0 as the Secretary General's mission might not be the right thing, but there are definitely various agencies and organizations that are doing really useful work, and they're just like giving them the capacity to do more data-driven work might be quite useful. On the other hand, there are also management structures that are like just not super well set up or just too calcified for things to move quickly. So there might just be a need for a generational shift, and it's unclear how like fast that can happen, or whether there is actually a new generation that understands data better, because a lot of the like pipeline for talent for the UN doesn't come from EPFL or ETHZ, but more from, for example, the Graduate Institute in Geneva. They are doing a bit more towards the like data sciencey direction, but very few people who go there actually have a very strong interest in that. So yeah, it really depends on the talent pool they draw from. And overall, I'm not super optimistic about the UN itself fundamentally changing, but there are various specialized agencies, various ecosystems that would benefit a lot from just having more data, having actors that supply more data, that process more information. I have talked at length with somebody from the Gates Foundation that is responsible for their food systems work, for example. And he says all of the relevant international organizations for food systems sit in Rome, and Rome only has one think tank that like contributes to thinking about food system stuff. The WHO has a wide range of organizations supporting its work. A lot of the disarmament work is supported by various think tanks and consultancy firms, etc. So just by having more capacity, these organizations might already benefit quite a lot. But then, of course, you also need to identify, okay, where are political gridlocks? Where are fights happening over budgets and funding, and like what can realistically be done? But I think that really needs to be assessed at a very contextual level, like for very specific ecosystems within the UN, and not looking at the UN as a whole. I think, for example, there are practical things that could be done for the BWC, where it's just supporting verification progress. That is really just, how do we collect data? How do we get data? How do we get people to think about like doing this in a very structured way, such that we can actually keep up to date on developments in various places? And how can we improve the reporting there? How can we make that maximally easy? And things like this. That seems valuable. Seems like a capacity that currently doesn't exist very much. And similar things I would expect elsewhere.
Well, great question, but what I was thinking that when you
you said about policies and pushing the policies even at the local level as a kind of successful prototype, something that higher level. I'm thinking one thing about existential risks, I see as a kind of a challenging thing is proving that you are successful in preventing a risk, right? Like we are lucky with climate change to have a measure that is kind of CO2 level or temperature rise. It's a number, and then you say, oh, 2 degrees is bad, this is good. So it's easy to say, well, if you think about preventing a risk, and say, oh, nothing happens here. It's a good measure. So the question is there a measure that is out there in the policy making that tells you how good you are in risks?
I wish. No, there's like no concrete measure at the moment. People are talking a bit more about resilience, but resilience is usually not the sexy part in government, and people also probably think it's too complicated or not necessarily a super helpful way of looking at things. But I think that you could take more of a systems approach and just look at, okay, what are the weak links in our system? Like which parts of society are just much more vulnerable, or which information channels are likely to break down in which cases, and look at all these possible weak links and figure out how to make progress on them, and then just hope that that reduces overall risk. But you are very unlikely to have a good sense for how much your overall risk levels have reduced. And that's actually an ongoing discussion within the existential risk community of how to conceive of existential risks conceptually, but then also practically in implementation. Because if the only way that you can think of it is, okay, we either have existential threats that wipe us out or not, then this binary is very hard to assess. Whereas if you think about threats and systemic vulnerabilities, that gives you a sense for, okay, we can work on these systemic vulnerabilities, but then again, you might get drawn away from really caring about the very worst impacts that are just one-off singularities, and it's unclear how to approach that.
I have a follow-up question on that. What is the achievement you're the most proud of since you started SI?
That's a good question. I think I guess it's having realized that we have built up enough of a network and enough credibility within that network to be able to invite various diplomatic delegations and leadership from organizations on our terms. So organize private events that invite very important people using our framings and plugging them into the relevant academic networks, etc. So I didn't expect that we would be in a position to very quickly have convening power in any way. I thought we would need to do more lobbying, more kind of just outreach, meeting people, getting them to really understand what we want to focus on. And then that somehow worked faster than I expected. And then, various UN bodies reached out to us in the wake of our common agenda to say, hey, can you work with us on figuring out what intergenerational global public good governance looks like, or can you contribute to the global risk report, etc. So these things are just really cool to see that it's actually surprisingly easy to position yourself in a way that is relevant. Now I hope that we're also actually adding value. That's too early to say.
I'm gonna read Serge comments and questions. So, awesome work. It's really impressive to see the institute's name at the UN. He also says, I like the idea of independent diplomacy. In our Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian protests in Turkey already want to give Crimea to Ukraine and sign peace. Actual question. How is it possible on a human level to reconcile UN people and EA people? Did you have to wear a suit? Did they read Bostrom?
So I actually know of two people who have read Bostrom's Superintelligence, who are from the UN system. I think superintelligence in general is not a topic they would discuss very much. The UN has a very particular culture that you do have to adapt to. So like there are certain formalities that are just valuable to put everyone onto the same level. So usually, yes, you wear suits at UN events. You can try to be a bit more casual. I think it's also good to stand out sometimes and be slightly different. All within reasonable bounds. Like people still need to take you seriously also. And beyond that, I think it's very well possible to reconcile UN culture and EA culture. I think both have extremely different vocabularies, so it's quite hard. But if you spend enough time in both, then you can mediate. And that's what we've learned through, for example, this workshop picture that I had up earlier with the post-it notes, etc. You can actually also clarify a bunch of misunderstandings in this process. It's just really that people need to be willing to invest the time into exchange and processing this. That workshop that I had up was 1 2-hour session in a series of workshops where we really in a very structured manner set things up such that people think about where they themselves are, such that other people get a sense for where the others are at and what kind of language they are speaking, what they currently perceive to be the key problems and why there might be a mismatch between it. And then you also need to set group discussion up in a way that they are still productive. And I think that usually requires some kind of mediator, like facilitating actor. And that was extremely useful for us also, because then we learned to better understand, okay, what are people's worries in terms of engagement? And then it was super useful to have these 1-week breaks between sessions, because that allowed us to process a session, prepare the other one, instead of having session after session after session. Because then we could always reframe and kind of pick things up where they left off, but in a way that they would be maximally productive again afterwards. So it just requires quite a lot of careful work.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering, it's somewhat related to many questions that were asked, but so this model of long-term governance kind of just assumes that our current governance institutions, UN included, will even be around in the future. I mean, how do we begin to think about existentialism, long-term problems, and should we, when we're already seeing the negative impacts of technologies like social media and AI on like current democratic institutions?
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure what institutions for long-term governance would look like. And I agree that there are lots of things we should be worried about within the next 10 to 30 years, potentially shorter. I think that includes the risks I've been talking about, from nuclear, from synthetic biology, from AI. So a lot of these developments also happen much faster, such that we don't necessarily need to already have a plan for what to do for the next 10,000 years or so. We should probably just aim for preserving option space for future generations. So not creating institutions or going down development pathways that in the end create many fewer options that future people can choose from. So if we've like drastically reduced the amount of choice that people in 2200 can have in terms of development, because we have locked ourselves in at a certain level of human knowledge or so, and didn't manage to create better infrastructure to prepare to prevent to maintain our institutional knowledge, then we could just like already lose a lot of current knowledge that then isn't available later. So I would think that we can currently create institutions that just preserve knowledge and preserve option space. And that seems already quite relevant. And then that leads to existential risk reduction, I would think. Then we need to leverage current institutions.
Yeah, two of the main takeaways for me from the talk were that so policy change doesn't happen gradually and linearly with like scientific progress, but more like chunks.
Yeah.
And then the decision-making process for those policies is not this like neat democratic, like we assemble from all those opinions and then it bubbles up slowly and so on. But maybe there's a policy champion, someone pushes through or present interest in that. So given those two developments, things happen like very non-linearly, and there's key people that are involved. You stress the importance of like building a network and influencing those people. What are some like kind of out-of-the-box approaches and tactics that you could think of how to get to those people? Because it might not be, they might not be like standard talks or conventions or so, but one might have to go to Davos and like meet someone at the bar after one of the main conferences or so.
Yeah, so I think in terms of engaging key people who could be policy champions, a lot of things that are fairly normal for people to do at conferences are robustly useful. You just need to choose your conference well, and then you need to figure out, okay, who is the contact person that I actually want to put forward. So I know that, for example, certain key people in the EA community from Oxford have been at Davos and have been trying to like figure out, okay, how relevant is this? Do we actually want to engage more, or do we want to stay away from making a big wave by giving a talk or so, because we also don't know how this will ripple forward into these like networks. So there's currently a lot of cautious exploration, and I think sooner or later, once we have a clear sense of how we want to communicate risks, how we want to communicate the upsides, what we want people to focus on, what kind of solutions there are, you probably just want to be in relevant media and also figure out how to like get through to the people that are around key decision makers, such that the information does bubble up directly to them. It's like very clear that in Brussels, for example, there's Politico, that is one of the key newspapers that supplies a lot of the like daily briefings, etc. And then if you manage to just get into that information flow, that would probably be useful. But it's unclear whether we are at the stage of just like having this much outreach, because we wouldn't really be able to cope with all the demands that then come with it as well, because we would have to respond to lots of inquiries, etc. And I think the long-termist community as a whole also doesn't really have this capacity at this point in time to really do this broad outreach. And that's something that could be built up and needs to be thought about very, very thoroughly, I think.
It seems that this broad outreach that you're talking about can be very usefully done well, but what would be the steps to reduce both the risks of it not going well and of increasing your own capacity of welcoming people after this?
Yeah. So to reduce risks from outreach, I think we mainly need to have capacity to like follow up. So we need continuous engagement, because then you can still correct for framings. You can like figure out, okay, actually the message that we sent there wasn't entirely correct and somebody disagreed with it, etc. Before you communicate, you can have more retreats, conferences where you try to get key people together to agree on messaging. Then ideally build up the relevant capacity. I think my laptop died. Okay, good. Then you can try to build up relevant capacity mainly by hiring people and really getting very experienced communications professionals on board that understand the different worlds you're trying to bridge. And that for us at the moment means, okay, we will have some of our first hires who will be people from more the academic side of things that have thought about existential risk quite a bit in the abstract, but with applications to policy, because we still need them to be practically useful and to have enough of an understanding of multilateral policy. But then we also want someone who has worked with the UN system in the ecosystems that we want to engage with and has ideally done communications work there, such that these two people also become even better at bridging both worlds and writing good policy advice, or just like writing good public outreach pieces or giving good interviews, etc. I think that is a question of being well funded and of training. So there's also just a lot of learning by doing, probably. So you'd have to scale up incrementally, figure out, okay, where can I give a first podcast appearance where not everyone will immediately listen to me, and I can just figure out how I listen to myself. And then can like already learn from that instead of immediately reaching out to, I don't know, Le Monde and having very broad coverage. I think, yeah, those are the main things I can currently think of.
I have another question. What do you think should have happened for those topics to be actually included in the SDGs when they were defined?
So, like 2015, essentially. Yeah, I think the way things usually work is that they need to be salient. Like ideas need to be salient to people, they need to stand out, they need to actually be able to generate sufficient agreement. And it's not entirely clear to me whether that would have been possible. So like, of course, you can imagine a world where I think like many things would have been different. I don't know, COVID would have hit earlier and we would have had pandemic preparedness as part of the 2030 agenda already. But given that, yeah, a lot of the narrative was still around, oh, we're actually in a period of long peace. It's like less and less likely that big wars will happen, which now people are slowly moving a bit back on, and statistically also isn't entirely corroborated. I think the narrative back then was such that people were extremely optimistic. And I think you see this also in European politics still quite strongly, that people are optimistic and assume everyone else also has similar amounts of goodwill, and that like things will go well if you believe in them. And now maybe people are backpedaling a bit more on that. But to align lots of actors, so the SDGs were also developed with people from the private sector, with lots of civil society, and with academia. To align all of these, you often just like end up with a smallest common denominator that doesn't include everything you would want to include. And in 2015, we had just like the first years of the reinforcement learning like paradigm that like bubbled up. So AI probably wouldn't have been on the agenda, or could have been if they listened to Bostrom and like a handful of people who had this on their radar already, like in the early 2000s, essentially. But yeah, I think it would have been such a fringe topic that it would also have been really weird and potentially counterproductive. So one thing we also saw was that the discussions around lethal autonomous weapons were actually framed in a way that was really counterproductive for AI governance in general, because people hadn't thought enough about how to frame them, how to present them to people. So what people ended up talking about in the context of lethal autonomous weapons was like robots with guns, which is not the thing we are worried about, really. It's potentially one scenario, but the more threatening things are just autonomous systems in like various different ways. And then you could very quickly run into like the alignment problem. Just like you have various agents that like are extremely powerful, but instead discussions really focused on this like robotic element. So people also invited robotics experts as the scientific advisors to these processes instead of getting people from reinforcement learning. And then like AI is such a broad term that everyone like could situate themselves under. So there was also just a lot of like, yeah, a lot of clarification necessary that takes time. And it's like, of course, hard to think about counterfactuals. I think if there was a really well-resourced organization that really had banged the drum from a very like EA angle, then you could probably have pushed certain ideas into this process, because looking at how the prioritization processes happen, usually the UN is happy if there are people that have any idea in the first place. Like just already being someone who advances an idea is good. There aren't really processes in place for discriminating between ideas. They don't go around and like rank ideas or so. Often they try to just include everything. So doing work on having better prioritization processes could also be useful. That could probably have been done before. It also still doesn't exist now. So one thing that we identified in the context of this high-level advisory board that I was talking about for intergenerational global public goods is that they have a consulting process now, a consultation process where they invite various stakeholders over various sessions to like develop ideas and invite them also to write reports. And then they don't actually process the like proposals, they just summarize them. And then they eventually like list all of them. And it's unclear like whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. So there isn't really idea development, it's really just idea collection. And you would want much more a battle of ideas and then actual prioritization for things that are like the most relevant. So, but that's a very implicit process that happens maybe in backdoor discussions between a handful of people or like two people who are really like interested, or just in individual people's heads. So it's just generally not the best way to aggregate good thinking from leadership, I think. And these processes could definitely have been improved before. Like we had most knowledge on like how to leverage crowd wisdom or so already pre 2015. Yeah, I think otherwise I don't have anything smart to say right now.
Okay, thank you very much for this wonderful talk.